The USS Gallant dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Valori home system, and the first thing Danny Cole saw on the main display was wreckage. It filled the outer orbital lanes in vast, slow-moving fields. Pieces of ships, some still glowing with fading energy, tumbled through the blackened silence. Danny counted dozens of distinct hull fragments in the first 10 seconds alone. Whatever had happened here, it had been happening for a long time, and it had been brutal. "Silent running," Danny ordered quietly. "Kill all active emissions. Passive sensors only. I want to see before we are seen." The bridge crew moved fast, and without noise. The Gallant systems dimmed as the ship went dark, drifting on momentum alone, while her passive sensor arrays drank in every signal, every heat trace, and every electromagnetic whisper the system had to offer. Lieutenant Chris Hale, the tactical officer, was the first to put the picture together. He was a tall, quiet man, who rarely spoke unless he had something important to say. And when he turned from his console, Danny knew it was important. "Sir, I am reading 2 distinct groups of vessels deeper in system," Chris said. "The first group is smaller, lighter ships clustered around the inner planets. They match no known human design. Organic composite hulls, low-yield energy weapons, minimal shielding. I believe these are the ones who sent the signal. The second group is larger, more numerous, and closing on the first group from multiple vectors. Their ships are heavier, with chitinous hull structures and swarm pattern movement. They are attacking." Danny studied the display. The defenders, the Valori, were outnumbered and outgunned. Their ships moved in uncoordinated patterns, breaking formation under pressure, scattering like prey animals before a predator. The attackers moved with a single, unified purpose, closing in from all sides like a net being drawn tight. "Weapons assessment," Danny said. "What are we dealing with?" Chris ran the numbers, and then looked up with an expression that Danny could only describe as confused. "Sir, both sides are using directed energy weapons that I would classify as low-grade by our standards. The attacking ships, the ones with the chitin hulls, their primary weapon would not penetrate our standard hull plating. It would not even get through our outer ablative layer. The defenders are even weaker. Their weapons are almost entirely defensive, designed to deflect rather than destroy." Danny let that sink in. The Gallant was a destroyer, the second smallest combat vessel class in the Earth fleet. She carried kinetic accelerators, guided torpedoes, point defense systems, and enough armor to survive a direct engagement with a pirate corvette. And according to Chris, neither of the alien forces in this system could scratch her paint. "These people have been fighting a war they cannot win," Katie Lane said softly from her station. "They have been dying out here, and by our standards, the weapons killing them are almost toys." Nobody on the bridge said anything for a moment. The silence was heavy with something that was not quite pity and not quite anger, but sat somewhere between the two. Then the sensors picked up a new contact. A small Valori ship, badly damaged, was tumbling on an uncontrolled trajectory toward the Gallant's position. It was venting atmosphere from multiple hull breaches, and its power readings were fading fast. There were life signs aboard, faint and getting fainter. Danny did not hesitate. "Helm, bring us alongside. Ops, prepare the starboard airlock for emergency rescue." "Medical team to the airlock on the double." "Sir, if we break silent running, we reveal our position," Chris warned. "I know," Danny said. "Do it anyway." The Gallant powered up and moved to intercept the dying ship. The rescue operation was fast and rough. The Valori vessel had no compatible docking systems, so the Gallant's crew cut through the hull with plasma torches and pulled the survivors out by hand. They brought 11 Valori aboard, carrying them through the airlock like children. Danny went down to the medical bay to see them. What he found stopped him in the doorway. The Valori were small, barely reaching his chest in height. They had thin, hollow bones, wide silver eyes, and skin that shifted color with their emotions, which right now was a deep, frightened gray. They were huddled together on the medical bay floor, trembling, and they were not looking at the medical equipment or the unfamiliar walls. And they were terrified. Danny understood why almost immediately. Humans were from Earth, a world with gravity nearly twice what the Valori homeworld produced. Every person on the Gallant was, by Valori standards, unnaturally dense, heavily muscled, and built like a creature designed for combat. Human body temperature ran hot, and in the cool air of the medical bay, the Valori could feel the heat radiating from every person in the room. To them, the humans were not rescuers. They were monsters from a nightmare world. The ranking Valori survivor was an officer called Tyrene. She was smaller than the others, with a cracked ridge along the top of her skull, and one arm hanging limp at her side. She stood in front of her people, and faced Danny with her skin flickering between gray and pale white, which the hastily assembled translation matrix interpreted as extreme fear mixed with desperate courage. Danny crouched down slowly, making himself smaller, and spoke in the calmest voice he could manage. "You are safe," he said. "We heard your signal. We came to help." The translation matrix took a moment to process his words, and broadcast them in the Valori tonal language. Tyrene listened. Her skin flickered. She asked a question that the matrix translated as, "What kind of ship is this?" "A destroyer," Danny said. "One of our smaller warships." Tyrene processed this. Then she asked, "How many ships did you bring?" Danny paused. He looked at Katie, who had followed him down to the medical bay. Then he looked back at Tyrene. "This is just the scout ship," he said gently. "Bigger ones." Tyrene's skin went completely white. Her wide silver eyes locked onto Danny's face, searching for any sign that he was lying or exaggerating. She found none. Her legs folded beneath her, and she collapsed to the deck in a dead faint. The other Valori caught her and lowered her down, their skin cycling through colors that the translation matrix could not keep up with. Danny stood up and turned to Katie. "Get me a secure channel to Admiral Bishop, Priority 1. He went back to the bridge and composed his report while Chris kept watch on the tactical display. The Drakari swarm was still pressing its attack deeper in system, unaware of the human ship lurking at the edge. Danny chose his words carefully. He described the tactical situation, the weapons assessments, the rescued Valori, and their reaction to the human crew. He ended the report with a summary that he knew would be read by every flag officer in the fleet. "Sir, they are losing badly, but the threat level here is low by our standards. Both the attacking and defending forces use weapons technology that would be ineffective against our ships. The local population is fragile, peaceful, and completely unprepared for the kind of war being waged against them. They need help. They just do not know what kind of help they called for. I recommend the fleet proceed at best speed. These people are running out of time." He sent the report and sat back in his chair. On the display, the Drakari swarm continued its slow advance toward the Valori inner worlds, and somewhere in the medical bay below, 11 small, frightened aliens were learning for the first time that they were no longer alone in the universe, and that the answer to their desperate prayer was something far stranger and far more dangerous than anything they had ever imagined. Danny picked up his coffee. It had gone cold. He drank it anyway and watched the stars, waiting for the fleet. They came out of faster-than-light travel in a staggered combat formation, and the system shook. 14 warships of the United Earth Stellar Navy dropped into real space in precise sequence, each one arriving at a calculated position that formed a broad defensive crescent across the outer system. The carrier USS Resolute came first, massive and angular, her flight decks already cycling open as fighter squadrons prepped for launch. Then the cruisers, 4 of them, heavy and scarred from years of deep space patrol. Then the destroyers, fast and sharp, spreading out to cover the flanks, and at the center of the formation, like a fist wrapped in iron, came the heavy battlecruiser, USS Iron Promise. Captain Sam Griffin stood on the bridge of the Iron Promise, with his arms folded and his eyes on the tactical display. Sam was a broad-shouldered man with gray at his temples and a calm, measured way of speaking that made people listen when he talked. He had commanded the Iron Promise for 4 years, and in that time the ship had never fired her main weapons in anger. She had been built for a war that never came, designed to fight hypothetical human enemies in fleet-on-fleet engagements that existed only in war games and simulations. Her kinetic battery alone could throw tungsten slugs at a fraction of the speed of light, and her armor could take hits that would vaporize anything in this system. Sam studied the enemy positions and said nothing. There was nothing to say yet. Across the formation, every ship in the fleet detected the same thing at the same time. The Drakari swarm, which had been in the middle of a coordinated assault on the Valori inner colonies, stopped moving. Over 300 alien ships, spread across the system in attack formations, went still. Their sensor networks had picked up the gravitational ripple of 14 massive objects entering the system simultaneously, and for the first time in the history of the swarm, the collective intelligence that guided them did not know what it was looking at. Aboard the Resolute, Rear Admiral Nate Bishop sat in his command chair and reviewed the data streaming in from every ship in the fleet. Danny Cole's report from the Gallant had been thorough, and Nate had studied it 3 times during the jump. He knew what they were facing. He knew the Drakari weapons could not hurt his ships, and he knew that 300 alien warships were currently positioned between his fleet and a civilian population that was being systematically destroyed. "Open a broadband channel," Nate said. "All frequencies. I want every ship in this system to hear this." His communications team, led by specialist Meg Owens, had spent the entire journey preparing translations in every signal format they had decoded from the Valori distress beacon and from the Drakari communication patterns intercepted by the Gallant. Meg was a small woman with dark hair and sharp eyes, who spoke 6 human languages and had just spent 16 hours learning the basics of 2 alien ones. She nodded at Nate and opened the channel. Nate stood up. He was not a man who enjoyed speeches, but he understood the weight of this moment. Every word he said next would be the first thing an alien civilization ever heard from a human authority. He kept it short. This system and its people are now under the protection of the United Earth Stellar Navy. All hostile forces will withdraw immediately. If you do not withdraw, we will remove you. There will be no second warning. The message went out in 3 formats. The Valori received it first. Across their remaining defense stations and shelters, communication officers played the translated words and then played them again, because no one believed them the first time. On the Valori homeworld, High Coordinator Yulan listened from his bunker and felt his skin shift to a color that his species associated with something they had no word for. It was somewhere between hope and disbelief. The Drakari received the message as well, but the swarm mind processed it differently. The Drakari were a hive intelligence, a collective consciousness that operated through biological signal networks spread across hundreds of ships. It did not feel fear. It did not feel doubt. It calculated probabilities and acted on them, and right now, its calculations told it that 14 ships, no matter how large or dense, could not stand against 300. The full Drakari fleet shifted formation and began accelerating toward the human ships in a broad wave pattern designed to overwhelm through sheer numbers. It was the same tactic they had used against the Valori for 40 cycles. It had always worked before. Nate watched the swarm approach on his display. He did not flinch. He turned to his tactical officer and said, "Signal the fleet. Offensive formation Delta. Iron Promise takes the vanguard." Sam Griffin received the order on the Iron Promise and allowed himself a small, tight smile. He turned to his weapons officer, Lieutenant Tara Wells, who was already running final checks on the ship's main battery. Tara was young for her rank, with steady hands, and a reputation for precision that bordered on obsessive. She had run simulations of the kinetic battery thousands of times, but had never fired it at a real target. "Battery status," Sam said. "All tubes loaded and aligned, sir. Targeting solutions locked on the lead formation. 12 ships in the first wave, range closing to optimal in 40 seconds. Hold fire until I give the word," Sam said. He watched the Drakari ships grow on the display. They were moving fast, their chitin hulls glinting in the light of the system star, and they looked like a swarm of insects rushing toward a window. "Range is optimal," Tara said. "Fire," Sam said. The Iron Promise's kinetic battery fired. There was no flash of light, no dramatic beam of energy. There was only a series of deep, resonant thuds that vibrated through the hull as electromagnetically accelerated tungsten rounds left the ship at velocities that no species in this part of the galaxy had ever used as a weapon. Each round was a solid bar of dense metal, and at the speed they traveled, they carried more destructive energy than anything the Valori or Drakari had ever conceived of. The first salvo hit the leading Drakari formation. 17 ships came apart in under 4 seconds. They did not explode dramatically. They simply ceased to exist as coherent structures. The tungsten rounds passed through their chitin hulls as if they were not there, shredding internal systems and splitting the vessels into expanding clouds of fragments and frozen atmosphere. The second formation behind them flew directly into the debris field and took damage before the Iron Promise even fired again. When the second salvo hit, another 12 ships were destroyed instantly. Across the system, on every Valori channel, there was silence. The Valori had been watching the human fleet since it arrived, hoping and fearing in equal measure, and now they were seeing something that broke every assumption they had about what war looked like. They had spent 40 cycles fighting the Drakari, with weapons that could barely scratch the swarm's hulls. They had watched their own ships die by the hundreds. And now, a single human ship was tearing through Drakari formations like they were made of dry leaves. On the Resolute, Nate Bishop watched the tactical display update in real time, as the Iron Promise carved a path through the enemy vanguard. The cruisers were moving into position on the flanks, and the destroyers were fanning out to catch any ships that tried to run. The fighter squadrons were launching from the Resolute's flight decks, fast and coordinated, forming into tight groups that would hunt down stragglers. Danny Cole, aboard the Gallant, watched from his position at the edge of the formation. He had seen the weapons assessments. He had known, intellectually, that the Drakari could not hurt the fleet. But seeing it happen, watching the Iron Promise walk through enemy fire without slowing down, watching Drakari weapons splash against human armor like rain against stone, was something else entirely. Katie Lane looked up from her console. "Sir, the Valori defense network has gone completely silent. All channels. I think they are just watching." Danny nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "I think so too." The Drakari swarm mind recalculated. The first wave had been destroyed in under 30 seconds. The second wave was already taking losses, and the human ships had not yet committed their full force. For the first time, the probability models returned a result the swarm mind had never generated before. It was losing. But it did not retreat. It had never retreated. It did not know how. Instead, it did what it always did when faced with resistance. It committed everything. Every remaining Drakari ship in the system turned toward the human fleet and accelerated to maximum speed. And the largest engagement the system had ever seen was about to begin. The Drakari came in a wave that filled the tactical displays from edge to edge. Over 250 ships, every vessel the swarm had in the system, converging on the human fleet in a massive, coordinated rush. It was the same strategy that had crushed 40 Vylori defense lines over 4 decades. Overwhelming numbers, total commitment, no retreat. The swarm mind had run its calculations and decided that mass alone would carry the day. It was wrong. The human fleet did not brace for impact. It did not pull into a defensive formation or try to weather the storm. Instead, it moved forward. Admiral Nate Bishop gave a single order from the bridge of the Resolute, and the entire fleet shifted into an aggressive combat spread that opened firing lanes between every ship. All ships engage at will, Nate said calmly. Prioritize the lead elements. Do not let them reach the inner colonies. The battle unfolded with a kind of terrible efficiency that the Vylori, watching from their remaining stations, could not fully comprehend. The cruisers fired first, their heavy kinetic batteries sending coordinated volleys into the densest parts of the Drakari formation. Each volley tore gaps in the swarm, scattering debris and forcing the surviving ships to fly through the wreckage of the ones in front of them. The destroyers worked the flanks, moving fast and hitting hard, picking off Drakari ships that tried to swing around the edges of the human formation. Danny Cole pushed the Gallant forward on the starboard flank, his crew working in tight coordination. Chris Hale called out targets, and the Gallant's weapon systems responded with precise, measured fire. Each shot counted. Danny had trained his crew for years on simulations against human opponents, enemies who could shoot back, enemies who could hurt them. Fighting the Drakari felt different. The swarm ships were fast and numerous, but their weapons washed over the Gallant's hull like warm light and did nothing. Direct hit on our port quarter, Chris reported, his voice flat. No damage. Hull temperature increase of 2 degrees. That is all. Danny shook his head. These were the weapons that had been killing the Vylori for 40 years. These were the weapons that had burned colonies and shattered defense fleets and driven an entire civilization to the edge of extinction. And they could not even warm the hull of the smallest ship in the human fleet. At the center of the formation, the Iron Promise was doing what she had been built to do. Captain Sam Griffin had taken the vanguard position and driven straight into the heart of the Drakari swarm, and his ship was absorbing everything the enemy could throw at her. Dozens of Drakari vessels concentrated their fire on the battlecruiser, pouring energy into her armored hull from every angle. Inside the ship, the crew barely noticed. The lights did not flicker. The deck did not shake. The Iron Promise had been designed to survive combat against other human warships, against enemies armed with the same kinetic batteries and guided torpedoes that she carried. The Drakari might as well have been throwing sand at a mountain. Tara Wells kept the main battery firing in steady rhythm, each salvo carefully targeted and precisely aimed. She did not waste ammunition. She did not fire wild. Every tungsten round found a ship, and every ship it found came apart. Her console tracked the kills in a running count that climbed so fast she stopped looking at it. Sam stood behind her and watched the tactical display. The Drakari were dying in large numbers, but they were still coming. The swarm mind did not understand retreat, and it kept pushing more ships into the engagement, feeding them into the killing zone like fuel into a furnace. They do not know how to stop, Sam said quietly. No, sir, Tara replied without looking up. They do not. Above the battle, fighter squadrons from the Resolute swept through the Drakari formation in tight wolf-pack groups. Each group was 4 fighters, flying in coordination so precise it looked choreographed. hitting targets and breaking away before the swarm could respond. The Drukhari had no fighters of their own. Their doctrine was built on massed capital ships, and the small, fast human fighters slipped through their formations like needles through cloth. Meanwhile, aboard the Resolute, Nate Bishop was fighting two battles at once. On his left display, the tactical situation updated every few seconds, showing the steady collapse of the Drukhari assault. On his right display, Chief Medical Officer Dr. Amy Shaw was coordinating with the rescued Valori aboard the Gallant to build a medical profile of the Valori species. Amy was a calm, practical woman who had spent 20 years in military medicine and had seen more emergency situations than she cared to count. She had never treated an alien patient before, but she approached the problem the same way she approached everything else, with careful observation and systematic thinking. Through the translation matrix, she worked with Tyrene, the Valori officer Danny had rescued, to understand Valori physiology, their bone density, their atmospheric needs, their common injuries, and their nutritional requirements. Their bones are hollow, Amy reported to Nate. Average body mass is about 30 kilograms. They breathe a nitrogen-oxygen mix similar to ours, but at lower pressure. Their most common combat injuries are decompression and thermal burns from hull breaches. We can treat all of it. We have everything we need. Nate nodded. Start preparing aid packages for the colonies. As soon as this is over, I want medical teams on every damaged station in the inner system. Already working on it, sir, Amy said. Back in the battle, the Drukhari swarm mind made its final move. The collective intelligence had watched over 140 of its ships die in the first 15 minutes of the engagement, and it had processed enough data to understand that it could not win a straight fight against the human fleet. So it did the only thing its programming allowed. It identified what it calculated to be the most important enemy ship, the carrier Resolute, and it committed every surviving vessel to a single, massive strike aimed at destroying the flagship. Over 100 Drukhari ships broke away from the scattered remnants of their formation and converged on the Resolute from multiple angles. They came fast, pushing their engines beyond safe limits, their chitin hulls glowing with the heat of maximum acceleration. It was a suicide charge, and everyone in the fleet recognized it for what it was. Nate Bishop stood from his command chair. He looked at the wave of red markers converging on his position, and his expression did not change. He had been a naval officer for 30 years. He had trained for moments exactly like this. All ships, he said over the fleet channel. His voice was steady and quiet, and carried the kind of authority that came not from volume, but from absolute certainty. Weapons free. The combined broadside of 14 human warships fired simultaneously. It was a wall of destruction that covered every approach vector to the Resolute. Kinetic rounds from the cruisers and the Iron Promise. Guided torpedoes from the destroyers, spiraling out on smart trajectories that adjusted in flight. Point defense systems from every ship in the fleet, filling the space around the Resolute with a web of rapid-fire projectiles designed to shred anything that got close. The Drukhari assault wave flew into it and was erased. There was no other word for it. In 20 seconds, over 140 ships were reduced to expanding clouds of debris and frozen atmosphere. The kinetic rounds punched through hulls. The torpedoes detonated inside engine rooms and ammunition stores. The point defense guns shredded the smaller ships into fragments, no larger than a human fist. The wave simply ceased to exist, and the space around the Resolute was filled with a slowly expanding sphere of wreckage that glittered in the starlight like dust. What was left of the Drukhari fleet, fewer than 50 ships from an original force of over 300, broke. The swarm mind lost coherence as too many of its signal nodes were destroyed, and the surviving ships scattered in random directions, their coordinated intelligence shattered. They fled toward the outer system, damaged and disoriented, and the human fleet let them go. Nate Bishop sat back down in his chair. The bridge was quiet. On the tactical display, the last red markers were retreating toward the system's edge, and the space around the inner colonies was clear for the first time in years. From the surface of the Vylori homeworld, High Coordinator Yulan had watched the entire battle through the defense network's remaining sensors. He had seen the Drakari, the enemy that had haunted his people for 4 decades, the enemy that had seemed unstoppable and eternal, broken apart in less than 30 minutes by a force that had come from beyond the stars because someone had asked for help. Yulan's skin cycled through colors that his advisors had never seen before. His hands were trembling. He composed a message with great care and sent it to the human fleet on every channel his damaged communication systems could reach. The translation matrix processed the message and delivered it to every human bridge in the fleet. It was 3 words long. The silence after the battle was the loudest thing Danny Cole had ever heard. He stood on the bridge of the Gallant and looked at the main display, which showed the Vylori home system in a state he had never seen before. The red markers were gone. The Drakari assault formations that had filled the outer lanes were reduced to slowly drifting fields of wreckage that would orbit the system's star for centuries. The Vylori defense stations, battered and scarred but still standing, were powering up systems that had been dark for months. And in the spaces between, where combat had raged just an hour ago, there was nothing but empty black and the quiet hum of cooling metal. "Gallant, this is Resolute Actual," Nate Bishop's voice came through the comm. "All ships are to begin humanitarian operations immediately. Destroyers will sweep the debris fields for survivors. Cruisers will establish a defensive perimeter at the system's edge. Medical teams will deploy to all damaged Vylori stations and colonies. I want every person in this fleet working. The fight is over. The real job starts now." Danny acknowledged the order and turned to his crew. They were already moving. Katie Lane was coordinating with Vylori communication channels, helping to re-establish contact between stations that had been cut off during the assault. Chris Hale was mapping debris fields and identifying pockets where escape pods or damaged ships might still hold living beings. The Gallant's small medical team was preparing to transfer to a nearby Vylori orbital station that had taken heavy damage. In the medical bay, Tareen was awake and standing. The Vylori officer had recovered from her faint and had spent the last hour watching the battle data on a borrowed console, with an expression that the translation matrix could not adequately describe. When Danny came to check on her, she looked up at him with wide silver eyes and said something that the matrix translated as, "Your smallest ship could have defeated them alone." Danny thought about that for a moment. He wanted to disagree, to be modest, to say something diplomatic. But Tareen was a military officer, and she had seen the data. Lying to her would be an insult. "Probably," he said. "Yes." Tareen's skin shifted to a deep, steady blue that the Matrix identified as profound emotional processing. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "We spent 40 cycles dying. Entire generations grew up knowing nothing but the war. Children on our outer colonies never saw peace, and you could have ended it in an afternoon." Danny had no answer for that. He just nodded slowly and offered Tareen his hand to help her stand. She looked at his hand, so much larger and denser than hers, and after a moment, she took it. Her grip was light, almost weightless, and Danny held it as gently as he could. Across the system, the fleet worked. Human ships moved through the wreckage with methodical care, scanning for life signs and pulling survivors from shattered hulls. The Vylori they rescued were often injured, always frightened, and universally stunned by the size and strength of the humans who carried them to safety. The human medics learned quickly to move slowly, speak softly, and keep the temperature in the aid stations a few degrees cooler than they would normally prefer. Small adjustments, small kindnesses, they added up. Dr. Amy Shaw set up a field hospital on the largest Valori orbital station and worked for 18 straight hours, treating burn victims and decompression injuries. She trained Valori medics to use human medical equipment and learned from them how to treat injuries specific to hollow-boned physiology. By the end of the first day, her team had treated over 300 Valori patients, and the station's medical staff had started calling her a word that the translation matrix could only approximate as gentle giant. On the second day, Admiral Nate Bishop traveled to the surface of the Valori homeworld. He took a shuttle down with a small escort, and when the shuttle landed in the capital city of Varath, a crowd of Valori had gathered to watch. They kept their distance. The humans who stepped off the shuttle were the first Deathworlders most of them had ever seen, and the sight of beings so large and solid walking on their world was something between awe and terror. Nate was led to the council chamber, where High Coordinator Yulan waited. The chamber was built for Valori proportions, and Nate had to duck through every doorway and bend slightly to avoid the ceiling. The chairs were too small, so he stood. Yulan stood across from him, barely reaching Nate's chest, and looked up at the human admiral with eyes that held the weight of 40 years of war. The formalities were brief. Yulan thanked Nate for the intervention. Nate accepted the thanks with a simple nod. Then Yulan asked the question that had been transmitted across every Valori channel since the battle ended. Why did you come? Nate had expected the question. He had thought about how to answer it during the shuttle ride down, and he had decided that the truth was the only thing worth offering. He told Yulan about Earth. He described a world where the gravity pulled so hard that the trees grew thick and the animals grew strong just to stand up. He described oceans that could crush a Valori ship at depth, storms that could flatten cities, predators that had spent millions of years evolving to kill and eat each other. He told Yulan that humans had not become the dominant species on their world through speed or claws or venom. They had done it through stubbornness, through the sheer unreasonable refusal to lie down and die, no matter what the world threw at them. He told Yulan that humans had reached the stars 2 centuries ago, and had spent every year since then searching for someone else. They had found bacteria and fossils and empty worlds, but never a voice, never a signal, never a sign that anyone else was out there thinking and building and hoping. And then the Valori beacon had come through, faint and desperate, and it had reached a species that had been listening for 200 years. There was no debate, Nate said. Not really. Someone was in trouble. That was enough. Yulan was quiet for a long time. The color of his skin moved through shades that the translation matrix struggled to keep up with. Finally, he spoke. The device we activated was built by the precursors. We believed it would summon their guardians, ancient beings of great power who once protected this region of space. We thought we were calling for gods. Yulan paused and looked up at Nate with an expression that crossed every species barrier in the room. We did not expect to find neighbors. Nate smiled at that. It was a small smile, but it was real. Yulan asked the question that was underneath everything else, the question that his people needed answered more than any other. Will the Drakari return? They might, Nate said. The survivors that fled will regroup eventually. They will rebuild. They may come back. And if they do, then we will be here, Nate said. The words were simple. They were not a grand declaration, or a treaty, or a formal alliance. They were a promise made by one person to another, in a room that was too small for the person making it. But Yulan heard them, and he understood them, and his skin settled into a color that his species associated with safety. Back on the Gallant, Danny Cole stood at the observation deck window and watched the system come back to life. Valori civilian ships were emerging from hiding places all across the inner system, small and fragile and tentative, like animals coming out after a long storm. They fold the lanes with cautious traffic, moving between stations and colonies that had been cut off for months, carrying supplies and passengers and the simple proof that life was continuing. Katie Lane came up beside him and leaned against the railing. She had been awake for nearly 30 hours and looked it, but she was smiling. Earth Command just forwarded the latest numbers, she said. 96 ships have filed volunteer petitions to join the protection detail here. 96. And that is just from the Kepler Expanse fleet. Word is spreading through the whole Navy. Danny shook his head slowly. He thought about the signal that had started all of this. The simple, desperate message that had crossed 190 light-years of empty space. We are dying. Anyone, please. And he thought about the 96 ships whose crews had heard what happened and immediately asked to come help. 2 centuries of silence, Danny said quietly. 200 years of looking at the stars and wondering if anyone was out there. And it turns out, the galaxy did not need a guardian. It needed a neighbor. Katie looked at him. That is a good line, sir. You should put that in your report. You think so? I think the Admiral would like it. Danny laughed softly and turned back to the window. Across the system, on the Iron Promise, Captain Sam Griffin sat alone in his quarters and reviewed the battle data one final time. The numbers were clear and absolute. 0 human ships lost. 0 significant damage to any vessel in the fleet. On the other side, over 240 Drakari vessels destroyed or disabled. The engagement had lasted less than 30 minutes. Sam closed the data file and opened his after-action report. He wrote carefully and without emotion, documenting the engagement in the precise, factual language that military reports required. When he reached the end, he paused. The cursor blinked on an empty line. He thought for a moment, and then he added a final note below his signature. Recommend permanent diplomatic and defensive presence in Valori space. These people activated a device they did not understand because they had no other choice. They called out into the dark because they were dying and had nothing left to lose. They did not know who would answer. They did not know if anyone would answer at all. We should make sure they never have to call again. He filed the report and turned off his console. Through the viewport of his quarters, the Valori star burned steady and warm, and around it, human and Valori ships moved together in the slow, careful patterns of 2 civilizations learning to share the same sky. And on the homeworld below, for the first time in 40 cycles, the Valori slept without fear. The dark that had pressed against their windows for a generation was still there, vast and cold and full of unknowns. But now there was something else in it. Something large and warm and stubborn that had crossed the emptiness for no reason other than someone had asked. The fleet held its position among the stars, quiet and watchful, and the signal that had started it all faded into silence at last. It was no longer needed. The war had lasted 40 cycles, and the Valori were losing. High Coordinator Yulan stood in the dimly lit war chamber beneath the capital city of Verath, and stared at the holographic display that showed the slow death of everything his people had built. Red markers covered the outer colonies. Each one represented a world that had gone silent, swallowed by the Drakari swarm. The inner systems were next. Everyone in the chamber knew it. No one wanted to say it out loud. The Valori Communion was an alliance of 3 herbivorous species who had built their civilization on cooperation, trade, and careful diplomacy. They were not warriors. Their ships were light, grown from organic composites, and designed for cargo transport and scientific research. When the Drakari had arrived from the dark spaces between star clusters, the Valori had tried to negotiate. The swarm did not negotiate. It consumed. It moved from system to system like a living infection, and the Valori had been dying ever since. Yulan turned away from the display and looked at the 3 advisors who remained. Two of them were military commanders. The third was Chief Scientist Polon, who had been quietly working on something in a sealed research station on the dead moon of Verath for the last 8 cycles. Polon stepped forward now, her wide silver eyes reflecting the glow of the dying map. "There is one option remaining," she said. Her voice was thin and careful, the way all Vialori voices were. "The precursor device." The room went still. Everyone knew about the device. It had been found buried deep inside the moon nearly 100 cycles ago, long before the war. The precursors, whoever they had been, were gone. Their civilization had vanished so long ago that even their ruins had turned to dust. But the device remained, sealed in a chamber of metal that the Valori could not scratch, let alone cut open. It had taken Polon's team decades just to figure out what it did. It was a beacon, a distress signal broadcaster that operated on frequencies the Valori had never seen before. It did not send messages through normal space. It reached across dimensional layers, punching through barriers that Valori science said should not be possible. The precursors had built it as a last resort, a way to call for help from beyond the stars. Yulan had refused to activate it before. The device was not fully understood. They did not know who or what it would summon, but that was before the outer colonies fell. That was before the Drakari pushed into the inner ring and began targeting civilian stations. "Do it," Yulan said quietly. Polon bowed her narrow head and left the chamber. 6 hours later, the device activated. A pulse of energy, unlike anything the Valori had ever produced, erupted from the dead moon and tore outward through space, crossing dimensional boundaries and broadcasting a single, repeating message encoded in universal mathematics. The message was simple. It carried no coordinates, no species identification, no military data. It said only this: "We are dying. Anyone, please." The signal traveled far. It crossed empty systems and dead nebulae, and the vast black gaps between star clusters. And then, roughly 190 light-years from a small yellow star called Sol, it hit the sensor array of a United Earth Stellar Navy destroyer on routine patrol. Lieutenant Commander Danny Cole was drinking coffee in his command chair aboard the USS Gallant when the signal alarm went off. The Gallant was a small ship by human standards, a fast destroyer with a crew of 84, built for patrol duty and light combat. Danny had been commanding her for 2 years, and in that time, the most exciting thing that had happened was a navigational error that nearly flew them into an asteroid belt. He set his coffee down and looked at his communications officer. Ensign Katie Lane was already hunched over her console, her red hair falling across her face as she worked. She was young, fresh out of the academy, and she had a habit of talking to herself when she was concentrating. Danny could hear her muttering numbers under her breath. "Talk to me, Lane," he said. "Sir, I am picking up a repeating signal on a frequency I have never seen before," she said without looking up. "It is mathematical. Prime number sequence as a carrier wave, then a data packet that repeats every 11 seconds. This is not natural. This is someone talking." Danny felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Humanity had been traveling the stars for over 200 years. They had found bacteria on a few moons, complex plant life on a handful of worlds, and once, the fossilized remains of something that might have been an insect on a planet near Tau Ceti. But they had never found anyone who could talk back. "Can you decode the data packet?" he asked. Katie worked for another few minutes, her fingers flying across the console. Then she stopped. She sat up straight and looked at Danny with wide eyes. "It is a distress call, sir," she said. "The translation is rough, but the core message is clear. Someone out there is asking for help. They say they are dying." Danny stared at her for a long moment. Then he stood up and walked to the center of the bridge. Every crew member was watching him, They had all heard Katie's words, and they all understood what this meant. This was not a drill. This was not a false reading. Somewhere out there, someone intelligent, someone alive, someone capable of building a transmitter and crying out across the stars, was in trouble. "Send the signal and our analysis to Fleet Command," Danny said. "Priority 1. Flag it for Rear Admiral Bishop on the Resolute. And keep recording. I want every scrap of data we can pull from this." The message traveled up the chain fast. Within 2 hours, it reached the USS Resolute, the fleet carrier that served as the command ship for the Kepler Expanse Patrol Group. Rear Admiral Nate Bishop read the report in his quarters, alone, 3 times. Then he contacted Earth's Strategic Command on a secure channel and waited for the senior staff to assemble. The debate was short. There were voices urging caution, voices asking for more data, voices suggesting a small probe be sent first. But the signal was clear, and it was desperate, and every person in that room knew that humanity had spent 2 centuries wondering if they were alone. Now someone was calling, and they were calling because they were dying. The order came down within 6 hours. A full expeditionary response fleet of 14 warships, led by the USS Resolute, would jump to the signal origin. The fleet included cruisers, destroyers, the heavy battlecruiser USS Iron Promise, logistic ships, and a full medical support complement. It was not a scouting party. It was a rescue mission with teeth. Danny Cole and the Gallant were designated as the forward scout element. They would jump first, assess the situation, and report back before the main fleet arrived. Danny gathered his crew in the Gallant's small mess hall and told them what was happening. He simply said that someone out there had asked for help, and they were going to answer. Before the fleet jumped, Admiral Nate Bishop addressed all 14 captains over a secure channel. His voice was calm and steady, the way it always was, but there was something underneath it that every officer recognized. It was the voice of a man who understood that history was about to change. "We do not know what we are walking into," Nate said. "We do not know who sent the signal or what they are facing, but someone asked for help, and we are going. That is what we do. Prepare your ships. We jump in 4 hours." The channel closed. Across 14 ships, crews moved to battle stations, checked weapon systems, sealed bulkheads, and wrote quick messages home. And in the dark far away, the Valori signal kept repeating, patient and desperate, waiting for an answer that was already on its way.